In 2003, Kirk Bloodsworth received a phone call. On the other end of the line was a prosecutor. The same prosecutor who had stood in a courtroom and called him a monster. Twice. She told him they had found the real killer. Kirk already knew the name before she finished the sentence. Kimberly Shea Ruffner. Kirk had known Ruffner for years. They had lived in the same prison. They had lifted weights together in the same gym. Kirk had walked to Ruffner's cell every week as the prison librarian and handed him books through the bars. For years, Kirk Bloodsworth had been delivering books to the man who murdered the little girl he was convicted of killing. Ruffner knew the whole time. Every conversation, every workout, every book exchange. He looked Kirk Bloodsworth in the eye and said nothing. Kirk had spent 8 years, 10 months, and 19 days in prison for a crime this man committed. 2 of those years on death row, waiting to be executed for a murder he did not commit. And the real killer was 1 floor below him the entire time. This is the story of Kirk Bloodsworth, the most chilling wrongful conviction in American history. And the question nobody has fully answered: how does a system fail one man this completely, this many times, for this long? Welcome to Crime on Record, every case, on record. Let's get into it. Kirk Noble Bloodsworth was born on October 31, 1960, in Cambridge, Maryland. He was not a complicated man. He was not a troubled man. He was not the kind of person you would look at and think, there goes someone capable of what they accused him of. He grew up in a small coastal town. He loved the water. After high school, he joined the United States Marine Corps and served his country honorably. When his term ended, he was discharged with honor and came home to the life he knew, working as a waterman on the Chesapeake Bay, harvesting crabs and fish the way generations of Maryland men had done before him. He was 23 years old in the summer of 1984, newly married, recently moved to the Baltimore area for a fresh start with his wife. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no connection whatsoever to the crime that was about to consume the rest of his life. By every measure, Kirk Bloodsworth was an ordinary young man trying to build something. Within a year, he would be sitting on death row. The chain of events that destroyed Kirk Bloodsworth's life began on a warm July morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Rosedale, Maryland. And it began not with Kirk, but with a 9-year-old girl named Dawn Hamilton, who went outside to play and never came home. July 25, 1984. Rosedale, Maryland. Dawn Hamilton was 9 years old. She lived with her family in a working-class neighborhood east of Baltimore, where the houses were modest, the streets were quiet, and children still played outside without their parents watching every move. It was that kind of place. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, and nobody locked their doors in the middle of the day. Dawn was the kind of child people remembered, bright, curious, the sort of little girl who made friends easily and laughed often. That morning she had plans to meet up with friends and spend the day the way children did in the summer of 1984, outside, with no particular agenda, in the freedom that childhood in a neighborhood like Rosedale still allowed. She never made it home. 2 boys were fishing near a small pond at the edge of the woods not far from Dawn's house. They were the last people to see her alive. They watched her approach a man near the tree line. A conversation happened, brief, seemingly ordinary from a distance, and then Dawn walked into the woods with him. The boys thought nothing of it at the time. Adults talk to kids all the time in neighborhoods like this. It was not alarming. It was not unusual. It was just a man and a little girl walking into the woods on a summer morning. But Dawn never came out. Her body was found later that day in those same woods. She had been murdered. She was a child. What had been done to her was the kind of thing that leaves hardened investigators shaken for the rest of their careers. She had been violated and killed in a place where she should have been completely safe. 9 years old. Gone. The community of Rosedale was devastated in the way that only the murder of a child can devastate a community. It was not just grief. It was the shattering of something that could never be fully repaired. Parents who had sent their children outside without a second thought that morning suddenly could not. The woods that generations of neighborhood kids had explored became something else entirely. Dawn Hamilton was the dividing line between the before and the after. Police worked the scene carefully. They interviewed the two boys who had watched Dawn enter the woods. They described the man with her as best they could: slender, curly blonde hair, medium height. They worked with investigators to produce a composite sketch that was as detailed as two young boys' memories could make it. 3 other residents of the neighborhood also came forward. They too had seen a man matching that description in the area that morning. Near the pond, near the woods. A man who did not quite belong, who stood out just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be alarming. The sketch went public. Police released it to local media and asked the community for help. Tips started coming in. And then came the call that changed everything. An anonymous caller contacted police and said the sketch looked like someone they knew. A young man who had recently moved to the area. A man named Kirk Bloodsworth. Police pulled Kirk in for questioning on August 8, 1984, 2 weeks after the murder. They asked him about his whereabouts on the day Dawn Hamilton was killed. Kirk said he had a hard time remembering exactly where he had been. He said he had never been to the area near the murder scene. Police took his photograph, placed it in a lineup, showed it to witnesses. One of the 2 boys who had seen Dawn enter the woods identified Kirk as the man he had seen with her. There was a problem with that identification, a significant one. The man witnesses described was slender with curly blonde hair. Kirk Bloodsworth had red hair. He weighed over 200 pounds. He did not match the physical description that witnesses had given of the man they saw with Dawn Hamilton that morning. None of that mattered. On August 9, 1984, one day after that first interview, Kirk Bloodsworth was arrested and charged with the murder of Dawn Hamilton. The prosecution announced it would seek the death penalty. Kirk Bloodsworth was 23 years old. He had never been convicted of a crime in his life. He had no history of violence, no connection to Dawn Hamilton, no connection to Rosedale, and he was completely innocent of everything they were about to put him through. Kirk Bloodsworth had left Cambridge, Maryland, a few months before Dawn Hamilton was murdered. His marriage was struggling. He and his wife had decided to try a fresh start in the Baltimore area. It was an impulsive move, the kind young couples make when they believe a change of scenery can fix what is broken between them. Kirk found work, tried to settle in, but things were not going well, and after a few weeks he went back to Cambridge to stay with family while he figured out his next move. That brief period of instability, leaving town suddenly, having trouble remembering exactly where he had been on any given day, telling people he needed to get his life together, would later be twisted into something sinister by prosecutors who had already decided he was guilty. When police brought Kirk in for questioning on August 8th, they were not conducting an open investigation. They had a suspect in mind. The anonymous tip had pointed them at Kirk, and they had followed it. The questioning was not exploratory. It was confirmatory. They were looking for reasons to arrest him, not reasons to eliminate him. Kirk told investigators he had never been to the area near the crime scene. He was cooperative. He had nothing to hide because he had done nothing wrong. But when Detective Robert Capel asked him about a detail of the crime, a bloody rock, Kirk stumbled. He initially denied knowing about it, then said he didn't know why he had mentioned it to anyone. It was the kind of confused, anxious response that innocent people under pressure often give. But to investigators who had already made up their minds, it looked like something else entirely. They took his photograph and placed it in a lineup shown to the witnesses. Christian, one of the 2 boys who had been fishing near the pond, identified Kirk as the man he had seen walking with Dawn into the woods. The other boy, Jackie, could not make a positive identification. At a live lineup held days later, Christian initially did not identify Kirk either, but later said he recognized someone in the 6th position, which was Kirk. Jackie identified a completely different person. Of the other witnesses who had seen a man in the area that morning, some identified Kirk, others did not. The identifications were inconsistent. The physical description witnesses had originally given, a slender man with curly blonde hair, did not match Kirk Bloodsworth in any meaningful way. Kirk had red hair. He was heavy-set. He stood out from the description in ways that should have given investigators pause. They did not pause. There was also the matter of where Kirk had actually been on the day of the murder. His wife, his mother-in-law, and 3 housemates all testified that Kirk had been around the house for most of that day. 4 people placing him somewhere else. 4 people whose accounts were consistent with each other. None of it was enough. The prosecution had 5 eyewitnesses, people who said they had seen Kirk with Dawn or in the area. Eyewitness testimony in 1984 carried enormous weight in American courtrooms. Jurors trusted it. Defense attorneys struggled to challenge it effectively. The science of how unreliable human memory actually is, how suggestion, stress, and the passage of time distort what people think they saw, was not yet part of the mainstream legal conversation. Kirk Bloodsworth had no alibi the prosecution could not challenge. He had no lawyer with the resources to mount a sophisticated defense against eyewitness identifications. He had no money, no connections, and no way to prove a negative, to prove that he had not been in a place he had never visited. What he had was the truth, and in that courtroom in 1985, the truth was not enough. March 4th, 1985. Baltimore County Circuit Court. Kirk Bloodsworth walked into that courtroom as a 24-year-old man who had spent 7 months in jail waiting for a trial that he believed would set him free. He had maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest. He had told everyone who would listen that he had never been to Rosedale, had never met Dawn Hamilton, had never done what they were accusing him of. He believed in the system. He had served his country. He respected the law. He genuinely thought that when the evidence was laid out in front of a jury, 12 ordinary people would see what was obvious to him. He was wrong. The prosecution built their case almost entirely on eyewitness testimony. 5 witnesses who said they had seen Kirk with Dawn or in the area that morning. Christian, the boy who had been fishing, took the stand and pointed at Kirk. Other witnesses followed, each one adding another layer to the story the prosecution was constructing, a story in which Kirk Bloodsworth was a predator who had followed a little girl into the woods. The prosecution also leaned heavily on a statement Detective Capel claimed Kirk had made during questioning. According to Capel, Kirk had mentioned a bloody rock in a way that suggested inside knowledge of the crime. Kirk denied saying it the way Capel described, but the jury heard it. And in a courtroom where the prosecution was already painting Kirk as a monster, that detail landed hard. Kirk's defense tried to fight back. His alibi witnesses took the stand, his wife, his mother-in-law, 3 housemates, all of them saying Kirk had been home that day, all of them consistent with each other. The prosecution attacked their credibility. These were people who loved Kirk or lived with him. Of course they would lie for him. That was the argument, and it worked. The physical evidence told a different story from the eyewitnesses. There was no forensic evidence connecting Kirk to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no hair, no fibers, nothing that placed him in those woods. The only thing the prosecution had was what people said they saw. But in 1985, that was enough. On March 8, 1985, after deliberating, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of rape, guilty of sexual offense. Kirk Bloodsworth sat in that courtroom and heard those words, and later described what it felt like. He said everything went tunnel-like. He could not see, he could not hear. All he heard was the judge's voice cutting through the noise. On March 22, 1985, Judge J. William Hinkle sentenced Kirk Bloodsworth to death. Kirk was 24 years old. He had no prior criminal record. He had served his country honorably. He had done nothing wrong, and the state of Maryland was now going to kill him for it. Death row is not like the rest of prison. People who have never been there sometimes imagine it as simply a place where people wait, a holding area, somewhere between the verdict and the end. But that is not what it is. Death row is a psychological condition as much as a physical location. It is the experience of waking up every morning, knowing that the state has decided your life should end, that a date will eventually be set, and that on that date, unless something changes, you will be taken from your cell and killed. Kirk Bloodsworth arrived on death row at the Maryland Penitentiary in 1985. He was 24 years old. He had never harmed anyone in his life, and he was now living among men who the state had also decided should die, in a place designed to hold people until they could be executed. The isolation was immediate and total. Death row inmates in Maryland at that time spent the vast majority of their hours in their cells. The world outside those walls continued without them. Families aged, seasons changed, life moved forward for everyone except the men in those cells, who existed in a kind of suspended animation, waiting for either salvation or death, with very little in between. Kirk has spoken publicly about what those years felt like. He described the moment the prison doors shut behind him after his sentencing. The sound of those doors, he said, was something he never forgot. A 300-pound door slamming on his life. The sound of everything he had known disappearing on the other side of it. He was terrified, not in the way people use that word casually, but in the deep, existential way of a man who genuinely does not know if he will survive what is happening to him. He cried. He raged. He went through the stages that people go through when the unthinkable has happened, and there is no obvious way out. And then, slowly, he began to fight. Kirk threw himself into the prison library. He read everything he could find about wrongful convictions, about appeals, about the cases of men who had been in positions like his and had found a way out. He filed appeals. He wrote letters. He screamed his innocence to anyone who would listen, and many who would not. The first appeal paid off in 1986. The Maryland Court of Appeals vacated his conviction and ordered a new trial. The reason was significant. The prosecution had withheld a detective's report during Kirk's first trial, a report that pointed to another man as a viable suspect in Don Hamilton's murder. That was a Brady violation, a failure to disclose evidence that could have helped the defense. The court ruled that Kirk deserved a new trial because of it. For a moment, Kirk Bloodsworth had hope. Real, tangible hope. The kind that makes you believe the system can correct itself, that justice, however slow, is still possible. That hope did not last long. In April 1987, Kirk went back to trial. Different jury. Same case. Same eyewitnesses. Same accusations. Same result. Guilty again. This time, the death sentence was commuted to 2 consecutive life sentences, which meant Kirk Bloodsworth was no longer going to be executed. He was simply going to spend the rest of his life in prison for a murder he did not commit. Some people might consider that an improvement. Kirk Bloodsworth did not. He had now been convicted twice, by 2 separate juries, of the rape and murder of a 9-year-old girl. His name was attached to one of the most heinous crimes a human being can commit. His reputation, his identity, his future, everything that made him who he was, had been taken from him by a system that had looked at the evidence and gotten it catastrophically, irreparably wrong. Twice. He was 26 years old. He had the rest of his life ahead of him. And unless something changed, he was going to spend every single day of it behind bars. While Kirk Bloodsworth sat in his cell, convinced the system would eventually see the truth, another man was living 1 floor below him. His name was Kimberly Shea Ruffner. Ruffner had arrived at the Maryland Penitentiary in 1985, just a month after Kirk's conviction. He had been sentenced to 45 years in prison for burglary, attempted rape, and assault with intent to murder. Crimes committed against a young girl. Crimes that bore a striking resemblance to what had been done to Don Hamilton in those woods in Rosedale. Nobody connected those dots. Not the investigators who had built their case against Kirk. Not the prosecutors who had stood in court and called Kirk a monster. Not the prison officials who housed these 2 men in the same facility, in cells separated by a single floor, for years. Nobody looked at Kimberly Shea Ruffner and saw what was right in front of them. Ruffner knew exactly what he had done. He had been in that prison since 1985, carrying the knowledge of Dawn Hamilton's murder inside him every single day. He knew that the man upstairs, the man whose case was discussed throughout the prison, the man who insisted loudly and consistently that he was innocent, was telling the truth. He said nothing. Think about what that requires of a person. To watch an innocent man suffer, to watch him fight, to watch him file appeals and write letters and rage against a conviction that you know is wrong because you are the one who actually committed the crime. To look that man in the eye during workouts in the prison gym and say nothing. To accept books from his hands during library visits and say nothing. Ruffner did all of that, and Kirk had no idea. Kirk and Ruffner were not close friends, but they were not strangers either. They were two men doing time in the same institution, moving through the same spaces, existing in the same world. They lifted weights together in the prison gym. Kirk, who became the prison librarian in his later years of incarceration, regularly made rounds delivering books to the cells on the floors below his. He delivered books to Ruffner, handed them through the bars, exchanged the brief, ordinary words that prison librarians exchange with inmates. Kirk Bloodsworth regularly delivered books to the man who had murdered Dawn Hamilton. He did not know it. He had no reason to suspect it. Ruffner gave him no reason. There was nothing in their interactions that revealed what Ruffner was carrying. He was just another inmate, just another face in the institution that had become Kirk's world. But Ruffner knew. Every time Kirk handed him a book, Ruffner knew. Every time they spotted each other during workouts, Ruffner knew. Every time Kirk filed another appeal, every time Kirk's case was discussed in the prison, every time Kirk's name appeared in the news as the wrongfully convicted man fighting for his freedom, Ruffner knew. He had a history of attacking young girls that stretched back before Dawn Hamilton. He had been released from prison shortly before her murder and had returned to prison a month after it. The pattern of his crimes, the nature of what he had done to get himself locked up in 1985, should have made him a person of interest in the Hamilton case from the very beginning. It did not. The investigators had Kirk Bloodsworth. They had their eyewitnesses. They had their story. They were not looking for anyone else. And so Kimberly Shea Ruffner sat in his cell one floor below an innocent man and waited. For years, for decades, perfectly content to let Kirk Bloodsworth carry the weight of what he had done. It would take science, persistence, and 9 years of a man's life before anyone finally looked in the right direction. By 1992, Kirk Bloodsworth had been in prison for 8 years. 8 years of maintaining his innocence. 8 years of appeals that went nowhere. 8 years of watching his youth disappear inside walls that were never supposed to hold him. He had arrived as a 24-year-old newlywed with his whole life ahead of him. He was now 31 years old, and the life he had imagined for himself was gone. His marriage had not survived. It could not have. The strain of a wrongful conviction destroys everything around it. The person you were before it happened ceases to exist in the eyes of the world. You become the crime you were convicted of. That is your identity now. That is how people see you. That is what follows your name everywhere it appears. Kirk kept fighting. Not because he had a clear path forward. Not because anyone was telling him his efforts would pay off. He kept fighting because stopping meant accepting something he could never accept. Then in 1992, something happened that would change everything. Kirk was in the prison library, the place that had become his refuge, his purpose, the one corner of prison life where he had found something resembling meaning. He came across a book, a true crime account that described a case in England in which a new forensic technique called DNA testing had been used to identify a murderer named Colin Pitchfork. The same technology had also exonerated an innocent man who had falsely confessed to one of Pitchfork's murders. Kirk read that account and felt something shift inside him. DNA testing, a science that could look at biological evidence and tell you with certainty whose it was. A science that did not rely on what witnesses thought they saw, or what detectives claimed suspects said. A science that dealt in biological fact. If biological evidence from Dawn Hamilton's murder still existed, DNA testing could prove conclusively that it did not belong to Kirk Bloodsworth. It could prove his innocence in a way that no appeal, no argument, and no amount of insisting had been able to do. There was one enormous problem. Officials believed the biological evidence from the case had been destroyed. In the years since Kirk's conviction, the evidence had passed through various hands. It had been stored, cataloged, moved, and handled by different people in different facilities. Somewhere in that process, the official position had become that the relevant biological material no longer existed. For Kirk, that was devastating. The one tool that could save him, and it was gone. But Kirk did not stop. His attorney at the time, a man named Bob Morin, began pushing hard to locate whatever evidence remained. Morin worked with the Innocence Project, a non-profit legal organization that had been founded specifically to use DNA evidence to exonerate wrongfully convicted people. Together they pressed the courts, pressed the prosecution, pressed anyone with authority over the evidence to look again. And then someone looked in the right place. The biological evidence from Dawn Hamilton's murder, the traces of semen that had been collected from the crime scene and preserved as part of the original investigation, had not been destroyed. It had been sitting in a paper bag, in the judge's chambers, for years, through the trials, through the appeals, through the years of Kirk's imprisonment, through all of it. The one piece of evidence that could have changed everything had been sitting in a paper bag in a judge's chambers, unfound, untested, waiting. When it was finally located, the relief must have been indescribable. Kirk Bloodsworth now had something to test. He had a chance. Not a guarantee, not a certainty, but a chance. And after 8 years in prison for something he did not do, a chance was everything. Bob Morin and the Innocence Project pushed for court approval to have the evidence tested using the PCR DNA technology that Kirk had read about in the prison library. The prosecution agreed. The evidence was sent to a forensic laboratory in California, run by a scientist named Edward Blake. Kirk Bloodsworth waited. He had spent 8 years waiting for something to go right, for someone to believe him, for the truth to find its way to the surface. Now the answer was in a laboratory in California, and all he could do was wait. The results came back in 1993. The DNA in the biological evidence did not match Kirk Bloodsworth. Not a partial match. Not an inconclusive result. The DNA profile was incontrovertibly, unambiguously, categorically not his. The FBI confirmed the results independently. After 8 years, 10 months and 19 days in prison, Kirk Bloodsworth had proof. The results of the DNA test did not immediately set Kirk Bloodsworth free. That is one of the things people do not understand about the American justice system. Proving your innocence is not the same as being released. The machinery of the law moves slowly in both directions. It is slow to convict, and it is slow to correct. Even with DNA evidence sitting in front of them that categorically excluded Kirk Bloodsworth as the source of the biological material found at the crime scene, the process of actually getting him out of prison took months. 3 more months. Kirk had waited 8 years and 10 months. And then he had to wait 3 more months after receiving proof of his innocence before the state of Maryland would open those doors. Think about what those 3 months felt like. You have the proof. You know you are innocent. The science has confirmed what you have been saying since the day you were arrested. And you are still in a cell. Still waking up every morning behind walls that were never supposed to hold you. Still eating prison food, wearing prison clothes, living a prison life, while the paperwork moves through the system at its own pace with no regard for what it is costing you every single day it takes. On June 28, 1993, Kirk Bloodsworth walked out of prison. He had served 8 years, 10 months and 19 days for a crime he did not commit. He was 31 years old. He had gone in as a young newlywed waterman from the Maryland coast with his whole life ahead of him. He came out as something the world did not yet have a good word for, a man who had been sentenced to death, had spent years fighting to prove what he already knew about himself, and had finally been heard. The moment he walked out those doors has been described by people who were there as overwhelming. Kirk was not quiet about his emotions. He was not stoic. He had earned the right to feel everything he felt in that moment, and he felt it completely. But the fight was not over. A pardon was still required. In December 1994, more than a year after his release, Maryland Governor William Donald Schaefer granted Kirk Bloodsworth a full pardon based on innocence. Not a commutation, not a reduction of sentence, a pardon based on innocence. An official acknowledgement by the state of Maryland that Kirk Bloodsworth had not committed the crime for which he had been convicted, sentenced to death, and imprisoned for nearly 9 years. It was the first time in American history that a death row prisoner had been exonerated through DNA evidence. Kirk Bloodsworth was not just a free man. He was a landmark. His case changed the conversation about the death penalty in America in ways that are still being felt today. It demonstrated with absolute clarity that the system could sentence an innocent person to death. Not theoretically, not as a hypothetical argument. Actually, concretely, with a real man's real years and real suffering as the evidence. But there was still a question hanging over everything. If Kirk Bloodsworth did not kill Don Hamilton, who did? The DNA profile from the crime scene belonged to someone. There was a killer out there, a real one. The man who had actually walked into those woods with Don Hamilton on that July morning in 1984 was alive somewhere, living his life, while Kirk had lost nearly a decade of his. For 9 years after Kirk's release, that question went unanswered. The case sat in a file. The DNA profile from the crime scene existed, but had not been matched to anyone. Kirk knew his exoneration was not complete as long as the real killer remained unidentified. Don Hamilton's family knew it too. A little girl had been murdered and nobody had been held accountable. The wrong man had been punished. The right man had walked free. That could not be the end of the story. Kirk pushed. He lobbied law enforcement to run the DNA profile from the crime scene through databases. He advocated publicly for the expansion of DNA databases that would allow cold case evidence to be matched against convicted offenders. He became one of the most prominent voices in America for criminal justice reform, using his own story as the most compelling argument possible for why the system needed to change. And then, in the spring of 2003, a Baltimore County forensic biologist who had been reviewing evidence from unsolved cases found something. Biological evidence from the Don Hamilton case that had not previously been analyzed. New evidence. New DNA. A new profile to run through the databases. Investigators submitted it to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database that stores genetic profiles of convicted offenders. The database returned a match. The name that came back from the database was Kimberly Shea Ruffner. Kirk Bloodsworth already knew that name. He had known it for years without knowing what it meant. He had handed that man books through prison bars. He had spotted him during workouts in the prison gym. He had existed in the same institution as Kimberly Shea Ruffner for years, separated by a single floor, living out the consequences of a crime that Ruffner had committed and never confessed to. When investigators told Kirk who the match was, the full weight of it must have been almost impossible to process. The man who killed Don Hamilton had been living one floor below him the entire time. Not in a different prison. Not in a different state. One floor below his cell. Close enough that Kirk could have passed him in the hallway. Close enough that they had interacted regularly. Close enough that Kirk, as the prison librarian, had personally delivered books to the man who had destroyed his life. Ruffner had known.
Every single day he had known. Every time he saw Kirk in that prison, he had known. Every time he heard Kirk insisting on his innocence, filing another appeal, pushing for DNA testing, fighting with everything he had to prove what Ruffner already knew to be true. Ruffner had known, and he had said nothing. For nearly 2 decades, Kimberly Shea Ruffner had carried the secret of what he did to Don Hamilton and said nothing. He had watched an innocent man convicted. He had watched him sentenced to death. He had watched him spend years on death row. He had watched him fight his way to an exoneration that never should have been necessary. And through all of it, he had remained silent, perfectly content to let Kirk Bloodsworth's life be destroyed by what he had done. On September 5, 2003, Kimberly Shea Ruffner was formally charged with the rape and murder of Don Hamilton. He was already in prison. He had never left. The man who killed that little girl in 1984 had been incarcerated almost continuously since then, first for the crimes that should have made him a suspect in her murder from the very beginning, and then on various other charges. He had spent those years in the same institution as the man he had wronged most profoundly, living 1 floor below him, collecting his books, saying nothing. In 2004, faced with the DNA evidence that left him no room to maneuver, Kimberly Shea Ruffner pleaded guilty to the rape and murder of Don Hamilton. He was sentenced to life in prison. Kirk Bloodsworth received a phone call from the prosecutor shortly before Ruffner was formally charged. The same prosecutor who had called him a monster in 2 trials. She called to tell him they had found the real killer. Kirk has described that phone call in interviews since. He said he already knew the name when she told him, not because he had suspected Ruffner specifically, but because on some level the knowledge had been building toward this moment for years. When he found out that Ruffner had been in the same prison, 1 floor below him, he was asked how he felt. He did not talk about rage. He did not talk about wanting revenge. He talked about Don Hamilton. He said he thought about her, about what had been done to her, about the fact that for 20 years nobody had been held accountable for her death, that a little girl had been murdered, and the man who did it had spent those 20 years in prison for other crimes, while the wrong man took the blame for hers. He was asked if he wanted Ruffner to receive the death penalty. Kirk Bloodsworth, the man who had himself been sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit, said no. He said, "What for? Is that going to give me my time back? Is that going to bring Don Hamilton back? He has to be accountable for what he has done. But killing him will only let his pain go. We have to live with her pain, no matter how brief it might have been." That is not the answer of a bitter man. That is the answer of someone who had been through something so profound that it had fundamentally changed how he understood justice, punishment, and what it means to hold someone accountable. Kirk Bloodsworth had spent nearly 9 years in prison for Ruffner's crime. He had been sentenced to death. He had lost his marriage, his youth, his freedom, and nearly a decade of his life. And when the man who had done all of that to him was finally caught, Kirk's first thought was for the little girl who never came home.
What is a man's life worth? It is not a rhetorical question. In the case of Kirk Bloodsworth, it became a practical one, a legal one, a question that the state of Maryland actually had to sit down and answer with a number. Kirk Bloodsworth had spent 8 years, 10 months, and 19 days in prison for a crime he did not commit. He had been sentenced to death. He had lived on death row. He had been convicted twice by 2 separate juries. He had lost his marriage. He had lost his youth. He had lost the years when most men are building careers, starting families, establishing the foundations of the lives they will live for the decades that follow. What does the state owe a man for that? Maryland's answer in 1993 was $300,000. $300,000. Based on a rough calculation that Kirk would have earned approximately $30,000 a year as a waterman on the Chesapeake Bay during the years he was wrongfully imprisoned. 10 years of lost wages. That was the framework. That was how the state of Maryland chose to quantify what had been done to Kirk Bloodsworth. $300,000 for nearly 9 years on death row for a crime he did not commit. Do the math. That works out to roughly $90 a day. $90 for each day Kirk Bloodsworth woke up in a cell that was never supposed to hold him. $90 for each day he ate prison food and wore prison clothes and lived a prison life, while the man who actually committed the crime lived one floor below him. $90 for each day he maintained his innocence to people who did not believe him. $90 for each day his mother aged without her son. $90 for each day his marriage crumbled under the weight of something no marriage should ever have to carry. $90 a day. The state of Maryland eventually acknowledged that this was not enough. In 2021, nearly 3 decades after Kirk's exoneration, Maryland passed the Walter Lomax Act, a law designed to recalculate the compensation owed to people who had been wrongfully convicted. Under that law, Kirk received an additional $421,000. That brought his total compensation to $721,000. For nearly 9 years of wrongful imprisonment, for a death sentence, for 2 wrongful convictions, for the destruction of his marriage, his reputation, and the years of his life that could never be returned to him. $721,000. There is no amount that is right. There is no calculation that captures what was taken from Kirk Bloodsworth. You cannot put a number on the sound of those 300-pound prison doors slamming behind a 24-year-old man who had done nothing wrong. You cannot calculate the value of the years he spent fighting to prove what he already knew. You cannot compensate someone for nearly a decade on death row. The math simply does not work. Whatever number you arrive at, it is not enough. What Kirk did with his freedom is perhaps the most remarkable part of this story. He did not disappear. He did not retreat from the world that had failed him so completely. He did not spend his years nursing the bitterness that anyone in his position would have been entitled to feel. He became an advocate. Kirk Bloodsworth threw himself into the fight for criminal justice reform with the same intensity he had once thrown into the fight for his own freedom. He spoke publicly about his case everywhere he was invited. He testified before legislatures. He lobbied Congress. He pushed for the expansion of DNA databases and post-conviction DNA testing programs. His work was instrumental in the passage of the Innocence Protection Act of 2004, one of the most significant pieces of criminal justice legislation in American history. That act established post-conviction DNA testing programs across the United States and created federal funding to help people who could not afford to pay for DNA testing themselves. Kirk had not been able to afford his own DNA testing. His attorneys had paid for it out of their own pockets. He made sure that would never be the reason another innocent person stayed in prison. The federal DNA testing program created by that act was named the Kirk Bloodsworth Post-Conviction DNA Testing Program. His name, the name that had been attached to the murder of a child in 2 separate criminal trials, the name that had appeared in newspapers alongside the most heinous accusation a human being can face, was now attached to a federal program designed to free innocent people. Kirk Bloodsworth also became one of the most powerful voices in America for the abolition of the death penalty, not as an abstract moral argument, as a man who had lived it, who had sat on death row and understood in his body and his mind what it meant for the state to decide that your life should end, who knew from personal experience that the system capable of making that decision was also capable of getting it catastrophically wrong. Maryland abolished the death penalty in 2013. Kirk's advocacy was a significant part of what made that happen. The boy who grew up harvesting crabs on the Chesapeake Bay, who joined the Marines and came home to build a quiet life, who found himself in a nightmare that lasted nearly 9 years, emerged from that nightmare and spent the decades that followed trying to make sure it happened to as few other people as possible. If it could happen to me, Kirk Bloodsworth has said many times, it could happen to anybody. He is right. And that is the most unsettling thing about this entire story. Kirk Bloodsworth was not a perfect victim in the way the system sometimes demands. He was not someone with ironclad documentation of his whereabouts. He was not someone with powerful friends or expensive lawyers. He was an ordinary young man from a small coastal town
who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, identified by witnesses who were genuinely mistaken, prosecuted by a system that had made up its mind, and convicted twice by juries who trusted what they were told. It could happen to anybody. That is what Kirk Bloodsworth wants you to take from his story. Not just the injustice of what happened to him specifically, but the vulnerability of every person who has ever walked into a courtroom and trusted that the truth would be enough to protect them. Sometimes it is not. And the only thing standing between an innocent person and the fate that almost consumed Kirk Bloodsworth is the insistence, by all of us, that the system must do better.
Kirk Bloodsworth is alive today. He lives in the Philadelphia area. He makes jewelry under a company he calls Blood's Stones, crafting DNA pendants and exonerate rings by hand in his home. The rings are gifts he gives to other wrongfully convicted people who have been through what he went through. A small, handmade token of solidarity from one survivor to another. He still speaks publicly about his case. He still advocates for criminal justice reform. He still carries the weight of what happened to him with a grace that most people who have not been through it cannot fully understand. Dawn Hamilton would have been in her 40s by the time Kimberly Shea Ruffner finally pleaded guilty to her murder. She never got those years. She never got to grow up, to fall in love, to build a life, to become whoever she was going to become. She was 9 years old, and she was murdered in the woods near her home on a summer morning in 1984. And the man who did it spent the next 2 decades letting someone else take the blame. Kirk Bloodsworth did not get those years either. Not in the way he should have. Not in the way a man who had done nothing wrong deserved to have them. He got them back eventually, in the sense that he was released and pardoned, and compensated, and given the legal acknowledgement of his innocence that he had fought for. But the years themselves, the actual days and months and seasons that passed while he sat in a cell that was never supposed to hold him, those are gone. They cannot be returned. $721,000 cannot buy them back. What Kirk Bloodsworth's story leaves us with is not a clean resolution. It is not a story that ends with justice fully served and the scales perfectly balanced. The wrong man spent nearly 9 years in prison. The right man spent those same years living 1 floor below him, saying nothing. A little girl's murder went unpunished for 2 decades. And the system that allowed all of this to happen is the same system that is operating today, in courtrooms across America, making decisions about people's lives with the same tools and the same vulnerabilities that condemned Kirk Bloodsworth twice. The eyewitnesses who identified Kirk were not lying. They were genuinely mistaken. And that is, in some ways, more frightening than if they had lied, because it means the same thing can happen again. It means that somewhere right now, there may be a person in a cell who is telling the truth and not being believed, who is fighting with everything they have to prove what they already know, who is waiting for someone to look in the right place. Kirk Bloodsworth found his paper bag. He found his DNA. He found his way out. Not everyone does. If this case moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you think about the system differently, then subscribe to Crime on Record. This is what we do here. We find the cases that expose how justice actually works, not how it is supposed to work. We tell them with the depth and the honesty they deserve. We do not look away from the hard parts. Every case we cover is documented, investigated, and told with the detail it deserves. Because every case matters. Every name matters. Every year spent in a cell that was never supposed to hold you matters. Dawn Hamilton mattered. Kirk Bloodsworth mattered. Every case. On record.